So our guest today is a professor at Rutgers. He helped found MoCA, which is the Museum of Chinese in America here in Chinatown. He worked at NYU. He's working with the Ramapo Native Americans to create an ecological history of New York. He's done so much in New York. I'm super excited to bring him up. Please welcome to the stage Professor Jack Tchen. So here we are.
Hello.
How's it going?
Good. I'm
cool.
Good. I'm real good. This is a great crowd.
Yeah,
Fantastic
great crowd. They're a good crowd. Look at that. It's a guy who knows how to work the crowd. Look at that. First thing he says. I love it. I love it. All right. So real quick, so just so you know, this is a nice loose interview. We're going to be chatting, talking about some stuff. But this, like I said, this ain't your grandma's interview show. we're gonna get into it. So, okay, first question. How are you?
I'm okay, Tom.
You're okay?
Yeah.
Just okay?
Just okay.
All right, we'll work on that. All right. Tough crowd. All right, here we go. So I want to start off with what's interesting. I was speaking to you before this, and we've talked a little and corresponded a little bit. You're a self-described dumpster diver and anchor baby.
Yep.
Please explain, for the love of God.
Well, is anybody here an anchor baby? Does anybody know what that term means?
Oh, yeah.
You do? You do?
Oh, yeah. It was a meetup. The first meetup that I ever participated in was a dumpster diving meetup where we went around and scavenged leftover food.
A dumpster diver meetup?
Yes.
Did they write about that in Nonsense? Wait, no, we were talking about Anchor Baby, though, right?
Yeah. So, do you know what an anchor baby is?
Oh, yeah. That's,
Wait, you really...
parents had you to stay overseas.
Right.
I love how she said it cautiously. She's like,
Okay, so she got both
Yeah.
answers correct, which is that
yeah.
I don't have a prize for you, so sorry. But
So just so the people who didn't hear, she said that his parents had him to stay in the United States. So,
right.
Yeah.
Right. Are you a New Yorker?
No, I am.
Okay, now you are.
wow.
Well, so anchor baby. I'm an anchor baby. The only reason I was born is because the Chinese exclusion laws were in effect. And then when they were repealed in 1943, that law reverted to the 1924 eugenics law. Okay, so the 24 law was a eugenics law, and that was basically cutting back all immigration to the 2% of the 1890 numbers that were coming over. So it's really not just anti-Chinese, anti-black. I mean, those laws were already taken care of, Jim Crow, Chinese exclusion, but it's really a way to say that there were inferior Europeans, okay? So in other words, we controlled the population of these extreme, kind of others, but then, what about those Central Europeans, who are Jews, for example, and what about those Southern Europeans, which are Mediterraneans, which are like the lowest of the Europeans, right? So the eugenics laws were really trying to kind of further and further narrow down who was going to be in this country. So in 24, that's when the numbers of Jews, Italians, Greeks just dropped off the cliff.
And it's also important to note that the purposes of limiting them is almost this idea of like the breeding and this idea that it would make humanity inferior. It lists this mixing of cultures and all that. And it also dated back to before the 1900s when immigrants started coming in the mid 1800s and later 1800s. That was when it started to panic and they started to limit who came in. Before they cut it off completely, they limited it to people who had money, to people who weren't, who weren't a public charge, who weren't stupid or whatever. They had different ways of limiting it even before that.
Right. So
Yeah.
disabilities,
right.
and all these other things, diseases. So some of it was understandable, but a lot of it was based on certain notions of sorting, who's unfit, who's fit,
Right.
that kind of thing. So basically, the quota they had when my parents arrived on a visitor's visa in this country was 105. Okay. Well, it just turned out that quota had been filled. Okay, very quickly. So my father went around to try to figure out how could they stay. I had some siblings who were already studying here in this country, And basically they said, these are senators who are telling him this. The only way you can stay is if you have an American baby, a baby on American soil, which was a Supreme Court judgment that had been decided in the 1890s. And that, so I have 5 older siblings. The only reason I was born was that, okay? That enabled my parents. So I'm the anchor that enabled my parents to stay, right? So does that sound right? Okay. Okay, good. I just wanted to check because this person is very knowledgeable right here.
That's his fact checker, everybody. That's
right.
At Rutgers.
And of course my siblings were asking me, this is at the 50th anniversary of my parents' wedding, and we all got to say something. And the sibling said, why did it take you so long to figure this out, right? I mean, here I am in my 40s already, but nobody talked about it, right? So that's the thing. Now, I think because of that, I've always had this question that, why am I here in this country? Why am I in the Midwest, in a suburb, trying to how did I get here? Because my mother was talking about China, 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 missing China. Why am I here? Why was I born? And I think that question in terms of where do I belong, what's home, I'm American born, I'm an American citizen, but people would look upon me, especially during the Vietnam War, and say, you're a gook, all that kind of stuff. So it kind of got me wondering about this question of where is home, where do I belong? So the dumpster diving comes in when being in New York from 1975 from the Midwest, and then kind of checking out Chinatown and figuring out, well, maybe Chinatown is where I belong, And what started happening in the 70s in Chatham Square, do people know where Chatham Square is? Okay.
We're going to get this lady a mic.
Chatham Square, at the very bottom of Mott Street, Bowery and Mott Street kind of join, Park Row joins, right? Just off of 5 Points. Dumpsters started appearing on Chatham Square, and these were stores that had 99-year leases. 99-year leases, and the lease had stopped, and they were just being tossed out. So some of the oldest stores in New York City were basically just thrown into dumpsters. Olaf's Pharmacy, these old cigar stores, all this kind of stuff. It started dumping into, so we started pulling out the stuff from the dumpsters, old records, and none of the historical societies, New York Historical Society, Museum of the City of New York, they weren't paying attention. So that began the dumpster diving. Yeah.
And that was the foundation to, I guess, your work later with the museum and all that, right?
Yeah.
You just started collecting stuff.
Yeah. And this is stuff that people were not valuing because these are communities that nobody was really paying attention to, right? So that's part of the challenge. And that began to give me a sense of, maybe if I start doing this, I can connect to the history in a way that nobody else has been paying attention to, right?
Yeah.
So,
No, it's amazing in New York the kind of things you can get. There's a man, Nelson Molina, in Washington Heights. He has a whole museum. He worked for sanitation department for 37 years, and he collected garbage from his route for 37 years. He has a warehouse filled. There's letters from handwritten letters from JFK. There's all these crazy things in there that he's just found. You can find anything in New York. I found this whole outfit on the way here. My clothes I found in the trash.
Well, funny you should say that.
What's that?
Because I think, we talk about the fashion industry in New York City. Where does it come from? Well, it comes from basically the Jack tars who were, tarring up their pants to become waterproof as they were coming back from, they're discarding it. People wearing top hats. I notice you have a top hat, right? Okay.
What's going on over here? This is like, I feel like she's a plant. You came with a plant.
And people would just find things and put it together, and that was really, I think, the beginning of the street culture, right? So you're part of that, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, and so that began your work with you did the museum as well. So what do you wish people, knowing as much as you know about the history and also Chinatown, et cetera, what do you wish more people knew about Chinatown?
Well, boy, that's a huge question because I've spent all my time, trying to dig out the history. Mm-hmm. I guess the first thing is that it's really a gilded ghetto, right? I mean, the reason why it exists is because basically of the Chinese exclusion laws. The reason why the restaurants exist is because the laws said that Chinese laborers could not come here, But if you were a scholar, a student, or a businessman, you could come here, okay? So the businessmen had loopholes. So if you opened a laundry, maybe not quite a businessman, but if you opened a restaurant, you could be counted as a businessman. So you were therefore exempt from the laws. So all of a sudden you had these restaurants with like 100 partners. And the partners
Smart.
would rotate, right? I mean, this is how immigrants think, right?
Yeah.
This is how immigrants get here. They figure out a way, and you would rotate who was the manager, and the manager would be able to get around the exclusion laws and start sending family members over because they would have the papers saying, yes, I've been here, right? So that's why we have so many Chinese restaurants, not because, Chinese in Toisan or in the rural areas in China, in Guangdong province, naturally were cooks or naturally wash clothes, there's that kind of attitude, but it was because of that these were the ways that the laws shaped, and laundries are something that, it was black women, Irish women who were doing that work out here, but in California, nobody was out there doing wash, so that kind of emerged, and then laundry started moving eastward as that happened.
Mm-hmm. And remember, 3 times for every McDonald's in the United States. That's crazy. 3 Chinese restaurants. And you guys are all going to use that fact. You know I'm right. You're going to be walking around Chinatown and you're just going to slip that into conversation. Unbelievable. All right. All right. Well, to continue on, I guess that note, you were talking about how it is a result of those sentiments, et cetera. I hit on it briefly in my, I guess, little lecture, but Orientalism. A lot of people aren't really familiar with this idea of Orientalism, and I kind of hit on it with the idea of especially liberal people in the United States who are well-intentioned and they stick up for rights, et cetera. Like, Orientalism still factors in, and it is part of what allows things like the Chinese Exclusion Act to get passed. Could you speak more on that?
Yeah, well, how many of you, so this is like a test. How many of you have heard the name Edward Said? Edward Said? Oh,
You? How about you over there?
Edward Said. Edward Said. No.
Ah,
but we have
no.
somebody here. And
Edward
are there
Said,
more
yeah.
people in the back? Oh, there's a few people. Okay, great. Yep. Okay, fantastic. Edward Said wrote this book called Orientalism. He was a professor at Columbia. He was a classical music maven. He was really but he was also Catholic Palestinian. Okay, and especially it's apropos today. Given what's been happening. He began to look at really how knowledge about the Asia was formed. And he began thinking about it as either people were romanticizing the Orient, and a lot of these paintings of French Orientalist paintings of the palaces in which there are a lot of women represented, and they're just kind of all these women, and the architecture, highly romanticized notion. Or it was also schools of Oriental studies, which were meant to be ways in which the West would understand the Orient. Whatever that Orient is, right? Orient is where the sun rises in the East, and the Occident is where the sun sets, right, in the West. So it's really this notion of civilizational progress, right? It begins in the East, and then it ultimately moves westward, right? So it ultimately moves to New York, it moves to California, but of course, it moves back to Asia, right? But that part wasn't thought about, right? But this idea of Orientalism really was a way of knowing about the other, but it also ended up being very much, in terms of practice, a way of also representing villainization and criminalization. So when we think about all the wars that have been happening in the United States, a great many of them have been waged in Asia, one part of Asia or another, right? So in some ways, Orientalism and war is like a critical question because there's always an Oriental villain. Oftentimes, Xi Jinping now is really increasingly represented as a villain, although initially he was represented as a good guy. So these things shift in our lifetimes. Or Japan was an ally, so it's not just about Chinese. Japan was an ally. They were honorary whites. They defeated the Russians in a war in 1905. And then all of a sudden, the Japanese become bad.
Right.
And of course, that's because of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. But you always have to have a good Asian to counterbalance that. You'll see this in movies all the time. So the good Asian, of course, became the allies of the U.S. and China, right?
And what's interesting too in Said's book is he brings out a lot of people who were purported to support Asian rights and Oriental rights, etc. And even famous artists who wrote beautifully about their travels there and things like that. And beneath all of it, even when it is quote positive, there is a sense of otherness. And I think that's an important thing. It's whether it's exotic, like looking at it like it's an exoticism or eroticism or whatever, there's always a sense of otherness. So even if you, quote, support that side, you still leave room for things like the Chinese Exclusion Act to be passed and to get through by people who do not. Because you aren't really identifying at the end of the day with those people because you're considering yourself separate. And I thought that was really interesting how he lays it out. He goes through, people like George Orwell, all these Flaubert, all these very famous authors and people who've written beautifully who still carry that kind of sense of otherness with them. But
yeah, so Thomas Nast is a good example, right? That image of this supposedly he's pro-Chinese, but he's really representing the Chinaman, but also the Irishman in this very negative, caricatured way. But it also enters into sexual realms, right? In terms of, or physiological realms, so that Fu Manchu, you should check out Boris Karloff in The Mask of Fu Manchu. You can find that on YouTube. And he's represented as a mastermind who's been to all the greatest Western universities. He's a medical doctor. He's a genius, right? And he's really leading the mindless hordes from all of Asia to attack London, basically, and dominate the West, right? So there's that extreme of big brain or people who are just sheep following the big brain, right? So that works out sexually as well, right? So you can kind of think about that in terms of, let's say, the way Asian women are represented, in terms of incredibly exotic and erotic, and what white men want, and you see that still playing out in terms of the kind of dating and marriage exchanges that are happening online, right? And also the kind of plastic, they're more than plastic, the rubberized humanoid dolls, that there's a big market for. So the sexuality plays itself out. Or they're techno nerds who are brilliant and can master technology and are asexual, right? So it's one or the other, one extreme or the other, and no part of that kind of range that all humans are.
And that's an interesting point too, especially doing comedy. You see it a lot with jokes, stereotypes, and people. Now the whole thing is free speech. All this like I'm not racist. It's just a joke. All that stuff. But at the end of the day, those things do feed into that otherness, and that while that otherness may not be as quote toxic as, let's say, carrying tiki torches or whatever, it is still an otherness, and it is still adding to that sense of otherness, which paves the way for these other more extreme movements to kind of take hold. So it's something to keep in mind. I don't know. It's something you hear all the time in comedy shows too. Like, freedom of speech, freedom to what? Freedom to use slurs is what pretty much you want. Well, I'm going to get on a soapbox over here. Careful, I'm going to start getting riled up over here. Sorry.
Well, and part of what happens is that there's always another that you can play off, right? So that if the Irish are getting and treated, Irish speak with an Irish brogue, right? That's considered a compliment. But what is a brogue? It's a shoe. It's an Irish person speaking as if they have a shoe in their mouth, right? But the Irish are able to establish their own sense of being a New Yorker by writing about a black washerwoman and a Chinese laundryman, and that becomes the comedy relief for Harrigan and Hart's plays that are really popular in the Lower East Side. So the Irish are able to establish themselves as more human by having an other to kind of play off of. So that's a lot of where the comedy comes from, and that's the Bowery tradition, and that's the New York theater tradition.
Yeah, like a minstrel shows and all the different things that took place on the Bowery. So this is going to, I guess, feed into your work. You worked with the Mayor's Commission on landmarks and markers and statues and things like that. I guess along those lines, why this is something that I guess is relevant today with different statues that have been debated and discussed. We were talking about Columbus, even things like that. Now they're talking about Washington. Why are the statues that are put up why is their presence or their absence so important? And why, I guess, is the idea that, down the road we find something that person did do that is wrong, and why should it come down? What's the meaning, I guess, of that, the importance?
Yeah, well, this is New York City Mayor's Commission on Monuments, Public Markers, and Public Art. So it's under Bill de Blasio. And for example, you all know, you've heard of the kind of Confederate statues that have been coming down, which, from the north we understand that, but okay, Columbus statue, which exists in many cities, and Columbus Circle, the very tall column at 59th Street, on the west side, but also Teddy Roosevelt, the horse statue, Teddy Roosevelt on top, with an African-American man in a loincloth holding a rifle.
The Natural History Museum.
Natural History Museum, Native American man with a Western, with a Plains Indian headdress, also holding a rifle, and they're facing east towards basically the Metropolitan Museum. Okay, that was the design of that. Why? What are the issues with those? First of all, they're mainstays. They're part of what New York is about. It's kind of what we associate. But, Columbus, how did Columbus become such an icon for Italians? Because you have the Columbus organizations, you have, so it really happened because at the turn of the century, Italians were being lynched in places like New Orleans and Louisiana. Because again, eugenics, Italians were seen as Mediterraneans, inferior Europeans, and they're kind of swarthy, the Sicilians, there's some black blood in them, that kind of thing. There's always that kind of taint that exists. And the Italians began really protesting all this as a way of saying, well, actually, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants really revere Columbus, right, as a way of establishing the rights of the New World and coming to the New World. So they began saying, well, Columbus is actually one of us. And there are debates about this between Spain and Italy. Columbus comes out of the Mediterranean world. People begin to claim him. And all of those explorers were from one country or another, but they get hired as hired guns to kind of discover parts of what's the fastest route to the Orient, so they can get to trade with the goods, the porcelains, the teas, the lacquerware, the silks, all that stuff. And that becomes the competition of all these European explorers.
They were like daredevils. They were like just basically willing to die to just make some money, and adventurers.
Yeah. So Columbus kind of bumps into the Caribbean. And he thinks it's Japan. He thinks it's India. He doesn't really know where he is. He calls the people who are here natives Indians for that reason, because he really thought he was going to the Indies, right? So all of that is happening in a way that really. So who is Columbus? Who is he representing? So the Italians begin to embrace him, and he's one of ours, and that's a way for them to uplift themselves in the eyes of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and it works.
Yeah, that's probably also why they're threatened now. A lot of Italians are threatened by the thought of taking down those same statues, because it is part of the identity. Exactly. It is part of the pride and also what lifts them up. Yeah. I mean, we're getting heavy over here, baby. I don't know if you guys are sweating over here.
So what should stay up, what should be taken down?
Yeah.
I mean, those are really tough questions.
Yeah.
And when communities, but it's not like the city has its own history, because the city actually doesn't have a history about itself. So how do you make a decision about these things? Well, when the city doesn't have a history of itself, which does not acknowledge indigenous peoples, so we got letters from indigenous organizations saying, no, Columbus really led massacres. Right, he led massacres. So how do you take that into account? Is that what you want the city to identify with? Well, these are all private organizations that are raising monies to build these statues, right? So how do you figure all that stuff out, right? So I'm not going to give you the answer to that, because it's actually a more complicated process. And I'm not sure that we actually did it properly, because we only had 90 days to figure these things out. Okay, we didn't even get a list of all the monuments and statues and markers and all that stuff in the city. So it's a complicated issue, and New York City is really unable in some ways to come to terms with its own past, and we don't have a official history of the past. So it's actually really tricky to answer these questions.
Yeah, and I think the importance of it too, it's kind of like a long game. You know, these statues, these symbols that you have around your city not only speak to the people in the city and the people growing up in the city and what you find important, but also people visiting the city and how people feel when they visit or when they move there and the openness, et cetera. And especially in a city like New York where it's meant to be as open, and at least that's the fame of New York, is being open. That's kind of something you should try to kind of continue to foment, I guess. But I think it's time now, Professor, to move on to the part of the show known as the rapid fire questions. Nick, you want to hit? There we go. We're setting our faces on fire. Look at that. Rapid fire questions. All right. So we're gonna do these real quick questions. Gonna get to know the real Jack here. Ask you some questions and answer them in a rapid way, and we'll get through as many as we can. All right? Are you ready for this? You're not ready. Well, how does it feel to be a student for once, huh? This is how your students feel. Pop quizzes? Yeah, she's going to get help from her. What's your name, ma'am? Beth. Nice to meet you. Awesome. Good interaction right there. You see that? All right, let's do this. Here we go. If you could live anywhere else in the world other than New York, where would you live?
Brooklyn.
Other than New York?
I live in Brooklyn, okay? I live in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, one of the greatest places in the world.
All right. All right. I'll take it. I'll accept it. I'll accept it. I'll accept the Brooklyn pride. All right. Being in New York, what's the craziest thing you've ever seen?
I was on the subway with my daughter.
That's how most crazy stories start, by the way. On the subway.
And then there's this commotion. It's a packed car. And then all of a sudden, people are like looking around, they're moving around, and you think, a rat, what's going on? There's a praying mantis hopping around from person to person, a praying mantis, okay? And like people are going, ooh, wow, a praying mantis. And then before you know it, you hear, so, right? So it's the kind of classic New York story, wonder of nature, smash. Right?
Sure.
Just gone, yeah.
But also being in New York, I imagine that was probably someone's pet. What? Someone probably had it on a leash, you know. All right. Well, praying mantis getting stomped in the subway. All right. Doesn't make the top 5 things I've even seen get stomped in the subway. Actually, I think. All right. All right. Here we go. Kimu, what's your advice to someone who's moving to New York? Best advice you could give.
Well, I kind of would encourage people not to move to New York, because I am someone who did move to New York, but I moved to New York during the time when New York had hit bottom, right? So if you're going to move to New York, you have to move to New York not to up all the prices, you know, of real estate and all that. You have to figure out a way. If you're involved in the city at all, you have to figure out it's not just a job, it's not just your work. You have to be involved in creating something that contributes to what's great about New York, right? So that becomes a question: is money making great about New York? You know, is being a part of the culture and the scene? Is improvising with the people here part of what's being in New York, right? So like the fashion industry, mixing everyday stuff, not becoming just, you know, the high-end part, but really being part of everyday culture. So I would say
He's
that.
trying to get you guys all to go dumpster diving with him. Interpreting that for you.
Yeah, great.
No problem.
Thank you.
No problem. What's your favorite New York City movie?
Okay, so this may seem like a wrong, you know, an answer that you won't accept. Okay.
Sex and the City? What are you going to say? I don't know.
No. Has anybody seen The Creator? The new movie that's out called The Creator. No? You haven't seen it? It's not doing well. I would encourage you to see it, okay?
You were about to say it's not doing well. Guys, you really need to see this trash
Clearly,
movie.
nobody has seen it. Gareth, you know, so this is a new film that actually it's not doing so well. But far better than Barbenheimer, okay? And, okay, so the lead is...
You just lost half the audience, by the way, I think. Go ahead.
African-American man who falls in love with an Asian woman, and they end up having a child who actually is actually a robot. Okay.
That's not what I expected you to say.
So this is
Really
the Lower East Side Story, right? This is Lower East Side Story, right? Yep.
Yeah, giving birth to robots. A classic New York tale.
But we have to kind of metaphor. You know,
Yeah,
it's
of course.
a metaphor.
I get it.
It's a metaphor,
Yeah,
right?
of course.
It's a metaphor. But But the Lower East Side is exactly. That's the Lower East Side, right?
Where can they see this movie? Where can we see this movie?
Any theater that's still showing it, you know.
Good answer. I'll type that into Google.
But it's a science fiction. If you haven't figured this out, it's a science, and I really do encourage you to see it because actually it gets at some really important questions that is far better than Oppenheimer, far better than Barbie. So just go take a look at it.
I have a feeling you didn't like either of those movies before. Really hated Barbie over here. Okay, keep moving. What's your favorite restaurant in New York?
I'm not revealing my favorite restaurant.
You don't want people to start going there. Wow.
Any true New Yorker would tell you, unless it's okay. The reason is that I'll give you some criteria as to what a favorite restaurant. Why would you go there? Okay, it's not just about going to a Chinese place that has more Chinese people, although that helps, right? But it's also about going to like a dive, right? A place that you normally doesn't have a big sign, has not been reviewed, but checking it out. So my favorite dumpling places do not have reviews, right? So how do you go to a neighborhood and try to figure out where a really good dumpling restaurant is, right? So that becomes the question. So how do you answer that question for yourselves and have enough courage to go into a place that maybe they don't even understand what you're saying, okay? So that, I think, is my favorite restaurant, okay? But of any group, you can apply this for any group that's here. So it's really any kind of ethnic Uzbekistan, right? Tashkent, any place that's on the Silk Road, for example, there's a restaurant for that in New York City. So how do you go to a neighborhood and figure that out?
So your favorite restaurant doesn't have any reviews online?
And doesn't have a name in the front.
Wow. Yeah. Which dumpster is it? So I feel like everything has reviews at this point. Well, that's impressive. I actually do agree in a sense because I feel like your favorite restaurant will always be one that you kind of stumble on or find yourself. You can get recommendations and you go to it, you're like, oh, that was pretty good or whatever, but that's never the one that you go back to and you go to have your birthdays there and everything, because I'm kind of the same way. So I'll let that slide. Let's keep it moving. We got a couple more. Here we go. Okay, what's your favorite quote about New York?
This is obscure again. Excuse me.
Have you guys seen this terrible quote book that it's really terrible. Okay.
Okay, so Walter Lippmann, who wrote Public Opinion, is kind of long forgotten. He wrote a phrase in his preface to Morals, okay, called that included the phrase "the acids of modernity." To me, that's my favorite quote because in some ways that's New York City. In other words, I know it's obscure. I'm an academic. What can I say? But what it's really referring to is how modernity is constantly dissolving. So just when you found that favorite dumpling restaurant, it's gone the next day. Just when you found, the place that has been your favorite spot, it's gone. Just as your favorite neighborhood, it disappears very quickly. And it becomes a question of like kind of the Midas touch, or how does modernity is a process in which things are constantly changing, and it's not to say that modernity is always good. In fact, right. it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? So how do you live in New York City for more than 5-10 years and still stay connected to your favorite places? Because they're gone. Right. They're gone very quickly, especially during COVID. They just kind of disappeared very quickly, right? So that's like a constant challenge for anybody who's living in New York.
And that's actually, that touches on the other question I was going to ask you, which is what your slogan for New York is, but I guess the acids of modernity would make a good slogan. I think my slogan would be, wait, this bagel costs how much? All right, so last question. What is your favorite New York City historical fact?
Yeah, you've stumped the historian here. Okay, so I guess I would say that the historical fact is that the Dutch supposedly purchased Manhattan, right? And that anniversary is coming up, and there's gonna be a lot of celebrations around that. Don't believe the hype, because to this day, there's no document that actually proves they purchased Manhattan. There's no document. There's a reference to this purchase in a letter, but in fact, they cannot prove it. If you were to take them to a legal court, which I think we should, right? And to say, prove it, they will go through all their archives. They don't have that evidence. Right? So we really need to, in some ways, so China trade, why did the China trade happen? New York Before Chinatown is a book I did. The question there was, what did China want? What China wanted was certain things that they didn't have plenty of, but part of it was ginseng, okay? Their ginseng was on a shortage, in China. So you have, for example, the trade that China wanted was the ginseng root that was growing in the Appalachian Mountains, okay? So you'd have indigenous people digging up ginseng, which they were using for their own health, okay? Digging it up, trading it for a teacup or tea, okay? It ended up in New York Harbor on a ship called the Empress of China. This was the very first ship that traded with China. And then you trade, now the tea leaves were being picked in southern China, where my family's from, right? So you have these exchange chains that really are not just about extraction and extreme extractivism, which is really part of the reason why we have the mess that we're in right now with climate change and everything else. There's also relations between people. But we tend not to know what those relationships were between the person who was picking the tea leaves and the indigenous person who was also digging up the ginseng. So for me, the hope, this is the hope question. I think you asked a question about hope.
Yeah.
Okay. The hope question is that it's not just commodity for commodity. It's not just money in exchange for this, but we actually get to learn about who we're exchanging with, because that's our only hope right now.
Right. Okay. Well, that's quite a fact. That's a fact you dumped on us there, Professor. All right. So real quick before we end, one last question. Very important. Keep the answer short. Very important. This is a tough question. Will you be my friend? A lot of pressure.
Now listen, your slideshow was quite good. I mean, so that most people give tours of Chinatown, they do a terrible job. They don't do the research. They don't really think about the subtlety. So my answer is yes.
All right. Whew, you really kept me on the edge of my seat there. Playing with my emotions. Well, thank you so much, Professor Chen. I really appreciate it. And I'll take that mic from you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Wow, that was something. Give it up, guys. Professor Jack Tchen. All right, guys.